What up, you guys? In June of 2023, FedEx just announced that in Canada, they're terminating all of their contractors and essentially bringing everything in-house and turning those contractors into employees. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can look at this, both good and bad, and I want to explore that with you today. So first off, when we look at the Canadian market, there's only a few hundred contractors versus the United States, which has several thousand. So the markets are quite different, but I think that it is still going to have big effects in the US market as well. So because I've been in the FedEx world for nearly 15 years, I've seen a ton of different changes come through the pipeline. And every single time that we see a massive change, there is always someone that wins from it and someone that loses. Now, a lot of people will think that it's always bad and all these changes are going to screw us all over, or maybe it's always great. Oh, everything's getting better now. Oh man, we're getting more routes. This is wonderful. Neither one of these situations is right. I think a lot of times when we do see those people benefit, there are some people that lose. I think that this situation in Canada is no different. And so, for example, the way the Canadian contractor model is set up is very different than the way it is in the United States. In the US, you have to have a 5-route minimum or a 500 stop minimum, essentially. And in Canada, you don't have to have those minimums. So there's a lot of contractors that are much smaller than they are here in the US. Now, 15 years ago, in the US, you didn't have to have a route minimum either. And there were a lot of single route owners, and those single route owners oftentimes would sue FedEx and try to say that they should be classified as employees so they could get their benefits and paid time off and overtime, things like that. And so whenever we saw a lot of the lawsuits come in about the misclassification of whether they should be employees or contractors, it was from single route owners. FedEx decided to solve this problem by basically getting rid of the single route owners and making these sorts of route minimums. Now, the contractors in Canada that only own one route, they're going to benefit most likely from this. They're finally going to be classified as an employee. They're going to get their overtime, their benefits, and all those sorts of good things. But the guy that just bought 3 routes, that guy's probably not going to benefit at all. That's probably going to be pretty shitty, honestly. And these sorts of situations have happened before. We saw it whenever people owned one route and then FedEx said, hey, you have to own 5. And they couldn't afford to get 5 and they just got terminated. That stuff sucks, and that is part of the risk of this contract. Now, as far back as I can remember, people have always feared that FedEx was going to bring everything in-house. But the reality is that FedEx has paid out millions in lawsuits to settle out of court to try to keep that model in place to where we can remain contractors. And I think that we are going to continue to remain contractors in the US for the most part. And so what I like to do is basically see where we've come from historically to get a better idea about where we are now and where we might end up going. And the last time we saw some major contractual change like this, essentially was the 5-route minimum. When that happened, the people that owned 1 or 2 routes, they were generally given several years heads up. Now, it wasn't always like that, but most of the contractors knew far ahead of schedule that it was coming. In this case, these contractors were basically given a year. That's really fast. And the difference here between what's happening now and then is that back then, the large contractors that had a lot of working capital to be able to buy routes from smaller contractors, because those guys had to sell for pretty much pennies on the dollar, if anything, well, the large contractors benefited. In Canada, the smaller contractors are benefiting. The larger contractors are not benefiting because they can't use their working capital to buy any more routes because you can't do it anymore. Now, I think that the contractors that have a lot of working capital in this business in the US are still actually going to benefit. They're going to benefit because I think that this will inevitably spook a lot of US contractors into selling. When they go to sell, they're probably going to sell for cheaper. So people that feel confident that FedEx is not going to bring things in-house, they're going to start to pick up routes for a lot cheaper than they otherwise could. And so because of this news, I think that this will spook the industry to a certain degree, and when it does, it's going to decrease the valuation. Now, in mid-2023, a lot of the routes will list for somewhere a little bit under 4 times the net income. The question is, where will it be in the future? Will it be at 3 times, 2? Who knows? But I do think that whenever you have a very nervous contractor base, it's going to inherently pull those valuations down. Now, I think overall, the market is going to continue to be viable for contractors in the US. But I also think that in certain markets, that's not going to be the case. Now, I'm making guesses here because nobody knows what the future is, right? But I think that in certain markets and areas where it's been traditionally very difficult to serve those contracts and a lot of terminations happen in those businesses, well, I think that FedEx might take those in-house. And it might actually be really good because it gets a lot of the garbage routes that are currently for sale off the market. They should have never been sold. They should be in-house, and I think that that will be better. Now, again, brokers want you to think that all the routes are the same. It doesn't matter. They are. They're very different, and certain ones that are terrible are going to be taken in-house. I hope that's the case, and I hope we see these routes kind of disappear for the most part. Now, for the people that just listened to the broker and thought all the routes were the same and bought them equally, those people have an enormous amount of risk because they might have actually inadvertently bought those garbage routes, which I think might have the potential to be brought in-house. Now, again, maybe it's brought in-house in 5 years, 10 years, who knows what it's going to be, or even if it happens at all. But we're just looking at the risk levels. We don't know what's going to happen, but we know that certain routes are probably going to have higher risk. Now, a lot of times people point fingers and say, well, the risk is all because you bought this business and it only has a 1-year contract. A lot of franchises have 15-year contracts, and they are just as risky, if not even much more so. A lot of people that bought a gym right before COVID had an enormous amount of risk versus FedEx basically having zero risk because we exploded in terms of the amount of volume and profitability for a lot of those routes. So it's not like there's one good thing or one bad thing that creates or causes all the risk. It's not quite like that. There is risk in this contract for sure. And we're seeing that right now as people get brought in-house in Canada. And so clearly there's no escaping the risk of owning these types of businesses. The question is, where is the risk? Is it operational? Is it market? Is your acquisition? Is it your transition risk? And then secondly, how much risk are you experiencing under that? Now, it used to be before that we had very little market risk. Most of the time, e-commerce was growing for most of the years, and most of the time, FedEx was fairly stable. Now, that risk profile is clearly changing. Does that mean that it's bad and that it's a bad idea? No. But does it mean that someone that's getting into this business has to have a higher tolerance for risk? Absolutely. So I think what will be helpful at this point is to share with you a story about where I was working with a private equity company that was evaluating FedEx routes. And I've worked with a lot of private equity companies, and they have similar sorts of ideas here. But just to summarize, they were going to be completely absentee, and they knew that their chances of being terminated was fairly high. So they had sort of modeled out what would happen if we got terminated in 5, 6, 7 years and lost everything in this business. They knew that in that case, even if they got terminated at year 5, they would still have so much cash flow and so much return on this business that it was better than anything else that they were currently looking at. So they decided to move forward. I think other people will have to start to have a very similar mentality as a private equity company that can look at this business and say, look, if they bring us all in-house in 6 years, is this still going to be a good idea? The answer, a lot of times, is probably still going to be yes, especially if we start to see valuations decrease in this business overall. So the point is, nobody knows the future, but hopefully you're in a better spot to be able to see the differences between Canada and US markets, and also seeing the past that's happened in regards to the changes that have happened at FedEx. And then you can start to say, hey, these people are overreacting. I'm going to be able to get some sweet deals. I don't think FedEx is going to bring us all in-house. That's crazy. And you also might be able to say, hey, this market here, that might be one that could likely be brought in-house. I don't want to deal with this. Or you might say, the risk is too high in every one of these routes. I just need to find a different business. Either way, hopefully you're in a better spot. Hopefully this helps out a little bit. Like, comment, subscribe. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.